Thank you, thank you. Can you hear me well? So, good morning. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. Just a quick intro. My name is Neila Zerguini. I'm a partner in cybersecurity at Deloitte. I came from your neighbor in the north. I came across the FAIR methodology for the first time when I was trying to effectively stop a discussion that was getting nowhere by trying to leverage the numbers and the power of quantification. And I'm very happy today to discuss a little bit more how can we do that effectively for discussions with regulators. So I have the privilege to introduce our speakers today, and thank you very much for being with us. Christopher Porter, who is SVP and CISO of Fannie Mae and board director of the FAIR Institute. Thank you very much, Chris, for sharing your experience with us. And James Lamb, board director of Blackrock iShares and also board of director of the FAIR Institute. Thank you very much, James. So because this is called a fireside chat, it's gonna be more cozy if I come.
You have to pretend there's a fire right here in front of us.
Exactly. And we have to not panic. So maybe let's start with you, Chris. What kind of conversations do CISO get with regulators? Or what kind of conversations do CISO have about regulators internally?
Well, first I want to thank you for the FAIR Institute and SAFE and all the other folks who have sponsored this event. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to learn. I am sad that there's some really good sessions that are going on right now that I won't be able to listen to, but hopefully I'll be able to get out there and watch some of the recordings. You know, I think that one other thing, all opinions are my own. This is my disclaimer. Are there any regulators in the room? I'm somebody else. No. But I think there's a lot of conversations that CISOs in general are having with and about regulators. You know, for starters, I think there's the stuff that we deal with all the time, which is we're being examined by regulators on the cybersecurity practices and programs that we all have in place. And so each of the different regulators are going to have some level of exam handbook that they're going into all of our organizations and saying, hey, you need to meet this level of compliance to these standards. And they're, you know, ultimately that's one of the good things and bad things about regulation is that they're raising the level of the cybersecurity in all of our organizations. Whether or not those are the right things to do all the time, you know, I think that's where FAIR can come in. I think the second thing is, you know, there's specific conversations around practices. You know, I think that a lot has changed since some of the regulations have been created, and you know, you've got things like NIST that has even come out and changed some of their practices. Like think about passwords these days. Like the way password attacks have changed in the last 20, 25 years. And you know, you don't necessarily need to have a 47-character password these days when you have clipping levels and MFA and all these other things in place. But a lot of our regulatory guidance still says, hey, you have to have passwords of this length. You need to change them every 5 days. And not exactly 5 days, but like you have to change them regularly. And those are the conversations that you might have about specific practices that are a little bit more risk-based based on how these attacks have changed over time. And then lastly, I'd say the conversations that CISOs have about regulators is, hey, like the SEC in particular, like this is one that CISOs in particular have been very interested in when they are suing certain CISOs or because of some enforcement practices that they're putting out there, and like, how does that affect my personal liability? So there's going to be things like that. But overall, the conversations that I have with regulators is really about risk and then specific practices that we have within our organization in our program.
And including cyber risk as much as possible in the stress testing scenarios.
Yeah. Oh, yes. So I think this is one where, like, leveraging a capability like FAIR and doing cyber risk quantification helps with not only understanding the exposure that the company has to different kind of cyber risks, but how can it be leveraged for other types of things that regulators are looking at. So in a lot of financial services companies, there's this concept of stress testing. And really a stress test is where they're stressing the company's financials based on poor market conditions or poor economic conditions. And then does the company have enough capital reserves to be able to manage through that economic sort of downturn? And so the regulators in financial services, they'll come up with a stress test scenario, and then they'll add other things to it. And so in a stress scenario, they're going to throw another kind of event on top of poor market to whether or not you can manage through it. And so what I've been able to do, and I've seen a lot of CISOs leverage this, is like when they're quantifying their risk, they can take that same cyber risk scenario and work with the CFO in your organization and do some of those stress testing with the cyber scenario. Like, so if you had a big ransomware attack while you had poor economic conditions in the market where you were losing money, would your company be viable and be able to survive and have enough capital to get through to the other side? And so those are opportunities to have that. It's a different conversation with a different part of the regulator that's more of the financial side of the house.
Yeah, thank you. James, I think you're writing an article about improving communication between the risk audit committees, the risk officers, the CISOs and all that, specifically in banks. What are your key recommendations?
Yeah, good morning, and it's nice to be back at the FAIR Institute. This is my fifth or sixth FAIR Institute conference, and each one gets better. So Nick, good job to you and your team. It's nice to be with you on this panel. So I am working on an article about how the chair of the risk committee, it could be the audit committee, could work with the chief risk officer or the CISO, the head of risk, and also the bank examiner or your key regulator. Because I call that the trinity of good governance, right? Each one has different needs, interests, requirements, right? So the board is there to provide risk governance and oversight. And there's a duty of care, there's a duty of loyalty, and embedded in that's a duty of oversight, okay? The examiner or the regulator wants you to have, in banking, you want to have a safe and sound banking system, right? So they're looking for that. There might be other regulators in other industries. So we're talking about the regulator like if it was a single entity. And it's not, right? We have a lot of different regulators. I am sure within this room, we represent probably dozens of different regulators. Yeah. And if you're a global company, we're talking about hundreds, right? And they all have different levels of sophistications, different guidelines. Some are consistent, some are not, and some are very conflicting. So the needs and requirements are different, but we do have a shared interest of good risk management, good risk governance. So how do we align that? And I think it's really important to do that. And I'll use a case study in this article and then also with you, which is my experience on the E-Trade board. I was on the E-Trade Financial, the E-Trade Bank board for 8 years. I chaired the risk committee. And when I joined in 2012, we had 2 MOUs, right? And dozens of MRAs. MRAs, matters requiring attentions. So MOAs is like a bad thing. MOUs are a really bad thing. It's just like one step below this in disease order, right? So we were under a lot of regulatory pressure as a board, right? So it was really important for us to work effectively together. So I had an agenda of making sure that we enhance enterprise risk management, we enhance operational risk, cybersecurity risk, improve our risk appetite statement, improve our board reporting, having good metrics. We implemented Risk Lens at that time in terms of the FAIR methodology. And we wanted to provide a good feedback loop. But in terms of working together, and I'm going to author this article with commentaries from our previous CRO at E-Trade and commentary input from our former Federal Reserve examiner. So I think it's going to be a one-of-a-kind article where you're going to get all three perspectives. And we're going to talk about the things that we did together, right? In the beginning, there's a lot of mistrust. People say the regulator or examiners, they don't know what they're doing, right? They've never done it before. And they come in here, check the box, and they come with all this requirements and
Just remember, he said this, and I did not say this to any of the regulators
and
in the room.
I don't know this guy.
Yeah. I'm from Brooklyn, so I say it like it is. But that's what people say, right? And I actually have said this in front of a regulatory body. That's what people think, right? These regulators don't have practical experience. They don't know what they're doing, right? And then the regulators think of management, boy, they must be hiding something. There must be something there. We need to dig deeper and deeper. There is some mutual mistrust. And then even for the board, and a lot of times people say, well, the board is very high level. They don't have any risk expertise or experience. So I think it's really important to make sure that you really understand each other, what you're really trying to get to, and have good alignment. And I think one good practice is to build these relationships outside the scope of a board meeting, outside the scope of an examination. So I used to have one-on-one meetings between the risk committee chair and the examiner from the Federal Reserve, from the OCC. What's on your agenda? What's really important to you? Here, I'll tell you what's on my agenda. And we have that communication. And the same with the chief risk officer, because ultimately, he and his team had to implement all these standards. And to me, regulatory standards are necessary, but insufficient, right? As a board member, I demand compliance, but I also expect best practices. So it has to go above that. So I think having that alignment between these three critical parties is really important.
Yeah, I like the trinity of good governance concept. It's kind of, it has a by design tensions that, as you described it just now. And can you maybe give us some examples of how the FAIR methodology specifically, enables those key players to ease the discussion, build trust, and show due care?
Yeah, sure. So I think when you're dealing with regulators, because they come in and they have a very narrow focus in terms of examination scope. They have a lot of requirements, a lot of documentation they want to see. You feed it to them, and then they kind of maybe go into another direction, or they go deeper. But it's only one piece of the puzzle in terms of cybersecurity and enterprise risk management. So I think what we need to do when we're communicating with them, or when we're meeting with them, is give them the big picture, right? You answer their questions, you give them the documentation, but it's within the scope of the big picture. And then now you are controlling, directing, indirectly, the narrative. It's okay, this is how it fits in. So if you're interested in cybersecurity, maybe they didn't ask for a risk quantification, because that's not a regulatory requirement. It's a best practice. But we'll say, hey, here are the things that we have. We could show you the NIST maturity assessment. We could show you security ratings. We could show you our internal metrics. And we could show you the FAIR loss exceedance curves. In addition to that, when you communicate unexpected loss in terms of cyber to the regulators, or even to the board, you can't just show them a big number. If you show them a big number, you have to say, is that number within your risk appetite? So I think there are three key questions that the board and the regulator need to address. One is, what is your exposure, right? And that's the role of the FAIR methodology. So I know my exposure qualitatively and quantitatively. inside-out information in terms of what we think, and also outside-in information in terms of threat environment. So that's the big picture for cybersecurity. Here's our risk exposure. How does that exposure compare to risk appetite? You want to show that. Is that exposure going up or down, right? Some trending. And finally, very importantly, what is management doing about it? If you think that's exposure is too great or you want to lower that exposure, what strategies are you implementing to mitigate that risk? So it's not enough to measure and quantify risk. You really have to say, how does that support decision making at the board level and management level, and here's how we're doing it. So you're giving them more than they asked for. And I think that's a really good approach instead of playing defense, right? To say, okay, you want something, here's something, let me tell you why that's good, let me give you the big picture, and this is how we think about cybersecurity, this is how we think about enterprise risk management.
Yeah, less transactional and more like big picture, making sense of things together. So, Chris, would you have examples of how the FAIR methodology enabled discussions or supported, a better communication with the Trinity?
Yeah, I mean, I like that.
You must be Catholic.
That
you love that Trinity thing.
No, but I really like the image of the triangle.
I'll call it the unholy troika.
Oh, okay.
But no, I think that's a good sort of concept of talking about governance. I think there's a couple of ways that FAIR can help with good dialogues with regulators. One is, just like with cybersecurity, you have different specializations with your regulators. So like in cybersecurity, hey, you have your vuln management people, you've got your threat detection and response folks, you've got your identity and access management people, and those are even different than your risk quants who are helping you do all of your cyber risk analysis with FAIR. And just like in that space, the regulators have different levels of expertise. Like the same people who are doing financial stress testing at a bank or an organization are not the same people that are examining your IT infrastructure and what practices you have in place. So I think one thing that helps is that it's a structured way of showing risk assessments, right? Hey, you're identifying your risks, you're understanding what your exposure is in financial terms. You can really prioritize what things will drive down that exposure, as James just mentioned. But what I think it helps with is it gives a better conversation with the regulator about your business. I mean, that's what we use FAIR for, and a lot of CISOs use FAIR for, is, hey, I need to understand how this enterprise risk, cyber risk, affects the business. If I have a data breach, how does that affect the brand reputation of the company over the next several quarters? If I have a ransomware attack or a DDoS attack, how does that affect the availability and the revenue streams coming into the company? Those are good ways of translating that business risk to the company, to the board, but also to the regulator. So I could have that conversation with the regulator and say, hey, if we had a ransomware, this is what it would look like. If these systems went down, this is the kind of revenue that we'd lose over a period of time, and this is how much it would cost to rebuild and get back up and running. And that changes the conversation a little bit. So there's an educational aspect to this as well, is that most of the time, those regulators, they understand they understand IT practices, they understand how to audit and exam IT practices, but they don't necessarily get educated on, all right, at Fannie Mae, like how does loan origination work? How does capital markets work? How do we move money to earn interest on our liquidity overnight? Those are things that they're not getting educated on. But those are the kinds of things that I need to understand when I'm trying to protect the company and our most critical business processes. So I can have those conversations saying, hey, this is why we have these kinds of processes and parts of our programs in place. So it changes the conversation.
Yeah, a lot of pedagogy baked into making the discussion, a bit more, a bit closer to what they can easily digest, and maybe outside of the detailed processes. Makes me think of, when we gather for whether for the board or to do tabletop exercises and try to, prep specific incidents together and how it helps later on the communication. Do you have any examples of that, how it can help the board fare?
Yeah, sure. But before I go there, I just want to say Chris made a really good point about dealing with regulators in trying to educate them about the business, about best practices, right? So I always compare being a board member, and I think regulators are in the same shoes. You know, they don't have, they're not management. They're not there day to day. So when I think about management, you guys are watching a movie, right? You're there day to day, scene after scene, right? The directors and the regulators.
Is it a thriller or like
depends.
murder?
I don't know. I hope it's a good movie, right? So, but for the board members and the examiners, we get to see trailers every quarter, every year. We just see a snapshot of the business. So it's really management's job to give us a little recap of what happened last time and give us the kind of the whole story in terms of where we are, because we need to fit in terms of the things that we're thinking about, and educating them, as Chris pointed out, it's a critical part of that process. You know, I'll give you an example. I worked with a regional bank recently as a consultant, and their regulators were examining their GRC system. And they really dug in terms of, how you, what category, why some of these categories are not filled in, these fields are not, and how do you think about inherent risk versus residual risk? They just went down a rabbit hole. And then it just became really not very useful for either party. Whereas if you educate them that, okay, the GRC system is just a tool, right? FAIR is a tool. And this is how we use it to support the business and support risk oversight. Let us show you what you've asked for, but let me show you what are some other things that we do that are really important based on these tools. And so I think that's really important. So getting back to your question on scenario analysis, I think yesterday we heard in some of the sessions how tabletop exercises and scenario analysis involving the board and management, it's a critical exercise in terms of the types of risks that we face today, right? So I would say cybersecurity is one. I think many people have engaged in cybersecurity tabletop exercises. And I think having the FAIR model, where you could have that as part of the tabletop exercises, quantifying what your risk is, quantifying a potential breach, quantifying what your mitigation actions might be before or even after the breach, and lengthening the horizon of a tabletop exercise, because it's not just pre-breach, post-breach mitigation, those few weeks. You could do it over maybe a few months, right? That the cybersecurity program is a long-term thing. So let's play out a few months, maybe even a couple of years, in terms of what are the things that we have today, what are the controls we could put in, and then the FAIR model could underpin that with risk quantification. So you could look at action, reaction, and then you could have the breach within that. So I think the FAIR methodology could take tabletop exercises to just a whole new level if you quantify the risk exposure before, after actions, and also lengthening the horizon of the exercise. Now, beyond cybersecurity, I would say AI, geopolitical risks are also good candidates for tabletop exercises. Yes. And you may combine those, right? And, because AI, geopolitical risk, and cyber have interactions.
Absolutely. So
you might have scenarios that include those. And to me, all of those are considered gray rhinos. They're not black swans, because it's happening, but what is really a known unknown. So cybersecurity is a threat, you know AI is a trend that's not going to go away, and you know geopolitical risk. You see in the news, you can think about China, Taiwan, South China Seas. There might be even more geopolitical risk coming forward. So these are gray rhinos. You know something's happening. You don't know exactly when and how it's going to impact you. And that's where tabletop exercises, getting management and the board together and talking about these critical issues is so important. And then I think showing that to your regulator would also be a good conversation to have in terms of best practices.
Yes, very interesting. So select the trailer well, otherwise you might give the impression that it's a horror movie when it's a rom-com. Yeah.
I've never felt a rom-com at the board.
No. Okay, another kind of movie. You're mentioning baking in the quantification in your due diligence continuous activities to improve the regulation discussion because it's been just there all the time. It's not necessarily just prep for them. You bake it in early on, and going for hybriding scenarios outside of cyber because a problem never comes alone.
Right.
Yeah. Nice. Very, very good recommendations. Thank you. And Chris, how can FAIR help with the recent SEC disclosure rules?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, for those who are unaware of some of the changes that the SEC made last year, they made some pretty substantial changes to, like, one, how cyber risk is talked about in your 10Ks and 10Qs. But they also had some specific disclosure rules around publicly disclosing certain types of events they consider material. And materiality had two different sort of sides to it. You had the quantified material event, and then you had the qualitative material. And I think the quantified one is the one that I can spend a little bit more time talking about, just because it fits in well with the FAIR pieces. But when you, like what I did when this came out is I wanted to get myself out of any materiality decision whatsoever. Like if you think about SOX and materiality of financial statements, like I have to go in and sign my name in blood that the SOX controls that I have in place are right, and I'm not aware of any weaknesses that then go up to our disclosure committee and then to the CFO so they can sign our 10Ks. But I'm not making those materiality decisions around weaknesses in financial statements. That's a CFO and legal position, and always has been since SOX came about many, many years ago. And so when this came out, I mean, to me, this is the exact same thing, right? Like I can provide facts about a cyber incident, but ultimately the CFO and the legal organization needs to make that materiality decision for the company. And the good thing is on the financial side, I mean, we've had formulas for years on like how to calculate materiality. They've been doing it since what, 2003 or 4 when SOX officially came out, and they've started doing this kind of thing. And so what's good there is that you can leverage a lot of the FAIR analysis to throw it up against the materiality for like quantifiable side and say, hey, where are we? Is these kinds of incidents, are they going to be above the line when it comes to like a misstatement of your financials, or is it going to be below that threshold? What is the threshold for even having those conversations at a company? And your CFO, they all have this stuff already today. Like, hey, if anything's over 70 million, then we need to have that conversation. If it's over 2 billion or 3 billion, then that's obviously misstatement, depending on the size of your company. And these formulas have been in place, so you can have those conversations. The harder part is on the qualitative side. I've heard everything from talking to a regulator that if a single laptop was stolen from an organization, but it happened to be the CEO's laptop, that the average investor would want to know that the CEO's laptop was compromised. That's pretty low bar for like qualitative materiality for a company. Whereas like I think most companies, if they have something significant, they're going to disclose, but the rules are just really people are trying to figure out the rules still, and the SEC has started to provide some feedback to companies that have, disclosed on an 8K on certain types of cyber incidents and events, and basically said, hey, you can't put this out there and say that it's not material if you don't know it's material.
Yeah.
And use this other vehicle for this, and you're more than welcome to use that, but don't use this one over here. So I think, just like in the legal world, sometimes law takes a while to get figured out, and I think in this particular case, the regulatory guidelines, they're still walking the path of figuring out where it's gonna fall and sit, but you can have those conversations like around materiality. Like if I'm doing my risk assessments and I'm coming back with certain figures for tail risk or average losses, then I can have those discussions with our disclosure legal team and say, hey, these are the kinds of things that may or may not happen, and that might be worst case scenario, and they can start drawing the right sort of framework for making those materiality decisions.
Yeah, like it takes illustrations to clarify the blurry lines,
Yeah.
and it will take some.
Just like in the legal world, you need
Exactly.
case law to get rid of the blurry lines, and again, it's also a living and breathing thing. Like the law always changes, and so I think some of these things will get clearer over time.
I would say for both of you, and do you feel like the regulators are comfortable already understanding? I'm referring to the quantitative aspect of this, understanding the benefits, how the frameworks work in terms of FAIR, and would it be required to go an extra step there?
Yeah, I think it depends on the regulator, right? Even within banking, when you think about the Federal Reserve, the OCC, the FDIC, the finance agency, there's just a range of understanding and sophistication. Within the agency, there's a range of sophistication and understanding among the examiners, right? So depending on the team that you have. So I think it is important to provide them some basic education. They don't have to understand the FAIR methodology in detail. They don't have to be technical, but you could treat them like a board member, right? That you educate them from a governance oversight. This is the basic approach. And for financial regulators, they've seen value at risk, they've seen economic capital, they've been engaged in developing Basel III Endgame, which is a regulatory capital framework. So they understand that, they understand that. So I think, but if you're outside banking, then there might be more of a learning curve. But that's your job. Your job is to make sure that you meet the regulatory standards, but also informing them, educating them about your business context and about your risk management programs beyond the questions that they're asking you.
Nice, thank you. And
yeah, I mean, I think, ultimately, just like, I'll go back to the legal world a little bit. I think of regulators a little bit as like they're also judge and jury of your practices in your organization. And you're gonna have a range of interests. Like you're gonna have certain, like in the law world, like you're gonna have certain judges that are gonna have certain interest and a certain perspective. And so if you get one that is curious about FAIR, from an examiner or just generally regulator perspective, then I think you're going to have a different conversation than one that you have to spend a little bit more time educating things on. But again, I think James said this earlier. I mean, the regulatory pieces out there say to do risk assessments, but they don't tell you how to do risk assessments. And so there's a range of how to do that. You can do it in a very simple qualitative way that can hide a lot of your accuracy, and kind of you can do it in a more quantified, structured methodology that really translates things into business terms that a lot of your business folks will understand. And there's a range in between, hybrid, that you could also do. And so I think it's a matter of having that repeatable process that that you're using over a period of time to show how risk fluctuates over that same period of time.
And I think you really have to do it in a very diplomatic way. You can't say, oh, sit down, let me tell you FAIR 101, right? And then they feel like you're treating them like children, right? And you don't want that. You don't want to set that off. So you want to do it in a way that says, oh, this is why we think the FAIR methodology is useful. And this is, so you do it in a very diplomatic way. And I think this conversation that Chris is describing between the regulator and management, sometimes it creates that tension. And that's the power of bringing in a board member in terms of that conversation, right? When you bring in a board member, then it becomes a, this trinity, right? You think about a three-leg stew. It's a stable stew. Right? You take out one leg, you're in trouble, right? It's not stable. And I think bringing a board member, I think, diffuses the tension. And you could educate, you could communicate in a much more effective way because it's outside the scope of examination, it's outside of a board meeting. Yes. You're dealing with people. You're not saying, okay, he's an agency and it's my company. You have personal relationships that you really have to build and develop, and that personal trust, I think, is very important.
Yes, there's an element of influence too there, and I think it's time for us to open for questions. I have here, can receive your questions. If you have any question, please do submit.
Or you can just raise your hands, it's a small room.
Or raise your hands, yeah.
Old-fashioned way.
Okay. So James, you mentioned, providing certain numbers. One is, based on what is your exposure. The other one is, how is it compared to your risk appetite?
Yep.
So my question is, relative to risk appetite, like what elements are you helping to determine whether or not you're within the risk appetite, or like what, to do that comparison, I think a lot of people struggle with, how do I measure my risk appetite? How do I know? And so what comes into your particular model for that?
Yeah, so, the question is, I described earlier, the three questions that you have to ask. So one is, what's your exposure? Two is, how does it compare to risk appetite? How's it trending? And three, what you're doing about it. So the question is, as a board management, how do you determine appropriate risk appetite? And I would say there is some science to that, right? You could say, how much capital do we have to support risk? Because that determines your risk capacity. You do not have unlimited capital to absorb unexpected loss. So you have to say, okay, how much capital do we have to support risk? And what portion of that is allocated to operational risk, cybersecurity? So there's a quantitative aspect to that. But there's a kind of judgment, right? So when you think about loss exceedance curves, or if you look at security ratings, you look at phishing fail rate, every metric that you measure, you should put some risk tolerance against. So every KRI should be measured against a risk tolerance. Every KPI should be measured against a performance target. Otherwise, why are you measuring it? And how does the board and management know if it's acceptable, right? So I think it's a combination of quantification, capital constraints, and also judgment.
You just touched on an interesting point of making sense of both your internal risk management, risk appetite, to get ready for the compliance, so tying back to the big picture that you were referring to earlier. I have a little bit of a side question here on insurance. What percentage of the insurance industry uses the FAIR methodology from the visibility you would have?
Nick, you have the latest stats. It's like, like half the large insurance right now that we've been looking at, right?
I can speak to it, maybe you can comment for the recording, But, well, we have the #1 So I would say today my estimate would be, well, Marsh alone has 25% of the market.
Yeah.
The other one may have 12%, so we're talking about a third solidly in there. But the domain is off forward because they're going from a average, can I say, losses in the industry approach to a more specific tailored approach to companies. It's like my Tesla.
Yeah.
I got to break 50% of my insurance by taking Tesla insurance. Why? Because they're living off the data from my car, and they're not pricing for uncertainty. That's what these new insurance companies are doing. So there's a big revolution going on the cyber insurance side. You know?
Nice.
And so that's in motion right now. It's very fundamental. And so for those of you who want to have an insurance break, talk to these new insurance companies because they can help you price it according to your own risk, not what everybody else is doing,
Right.
which may be hiding a lot of uncertainty, and they will price uncertainty and
Yeah.
variance.
I think one of the other pieces, like using insurance data to validate whether or not your fair analysis is accurate or looks pretty accurate. I mean, I think that's something that is that we do. If you go through the process of getting your cyber insurance, for instance, it's almost going through like a massive audit and exam that goes really, really deep, like all the way down to like how many accounts have domain admin access in your organization and who's in them and how many, like it gets really, really specific. And they're basing a lot of this on the incidents that they've seen and the failures and root causes of those incidents around that. But what's great is like when they send you your pricing and the different levels of coverage, like whether you want 100 million or 200 or 300 or whatever, they're also providing you information around the kinds of public incidents that are out there, as well as the costs of those incidents that have been publicly disclosed. And so you get a really good way to level set on whether or not the estimates that you're coming up with when you're doing your risk assessment, what kind of exposure you have. You can actually see it with like real live data on how much payouts and how much this is costing different companies.
Yeah. And I would say cyber insurance is a key board agenda item. I mean, we look at it every year, and I think the fair methodology could be part of that kind of reporting, right? So it's up to management to come up with the insurance strategies, but the board has to oversee that and make sure that is acceptable to us and it's rational. So an example would be, a simple example is if you're looking at insurance and you're paying $10 million for it, and it reduces your unexpected loss or your capital, let's say by $100 million, that ratio, 10%, is your cost of risk transfer.
Yeah.
Now, if your cost of capital is 15%, then the cost of risk transfer is lower than your cost of risk retention. That's a good thing, right? That's going to create shareholder value. So that's kind of risk return trade-offs that you could look at with the FAIR methodology. You can't do that with qualitative risk assessments or heat maps, right? So I think that's the power of having a good risk quantification.
Yeah, it enables you to go further. It allows you to compare with a pool in terms of have you reasonably assessed yourself, and we see that we have a 40%, close to 40% insurances that are getting there. We're close to the end, and I'd like to.
You raised his hand.
Yeah.
This is going to be a public question because they are board members, so we could do it in private. I don't do it in public. If you had a magic wand, what would you want the institute to help you with in terms of educating the regulators? You talked about educating them, so you can do it one by one, but also as a body, what should we be doing? I'm not promising we can do it, but what should we be doing?
Well, I mean, I could start, and I know this is certainly things that we're doing as part of the FAIR Institute. One is educating. So every regulator wants you to pick a framework that you build your program around. And I know that Nick and others have talked to NIST around, hey, how can you marry up NIST with the FAIR framework to model cyber risk and have that be a standard and then baked into the standard. Anytime you can get into a standards organization, especially one that's going to be widely used across the industry, that's going to help educate regulators, because they're typically going to go ask, hey, are you using NIST as your framework? Is it NIST 2.0? Well, NIST 2.0 has these things in there around, how to do your risk assessments. I know a lot of companies are starting to move to CRI, I think, which is kind of a NIST and I guess the child of NIST and the FFIEC CAT tool that used to be there for some of the banking institutions. And baked in there is some quantification when you're trying to understand the significance and size and criticality of your organization in global markets and things of that nature. And that helps decide what level of control implementation you need to have across your organization. But I think having those conversations with the standard authorities and then with the regulators, I think are the right place to start.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would say, if I could wave my magic wand, we would create our own trinity of good risk governance. And I think the theme would be regulatory change management. And regulatory change management is how do we meet our current regulatory expectations and beyond, because the regulators are coming up with new things, right? Yes. So the trinity would be the FAIR Institute, would be the regulators, within industry, so it might be financial, healthcare, energy, and a group of industry people, management, board members, talk about, and this is outside of the scope of examination, outside the scope of a board meeting, so you could be frank, right? You could be honest, and then kind of get some alignment, and maybe publish something coming out of that. I think that kind of collaboration and alignment is just going to be very healthy for everybody.
For the evolution of the regulation and all.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you for sharing your experience with us. Thank you, everyone. And I think we're good for the next
We have
program.
a 15-minute break or
Yeah,
a 30-minute break?
we have a 15 minutes.
Oh my God.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.